and gentlemen, welcome to the podcast called The Artenders. This is Danny Lavelle, and I am joined this week, as usual, by my co-host Mac Welch. And this week, we'll be discussing a movie by Akira Kurosawa called Seven Samurai, a movie where some farmhands, from a nearby farm, some farmers, are able to recruit seven samurai to help protect their town in this movie from, I believe, 1954, and it is a long movie. But it is
a brisk 3.5 hours.
a brisk, if you can say that for sure. But a classic, heralded by many, and I think it's clear when you kind of see, oh man, I recognize this trope, and it's because this movie originated it.
Yeah.
But one thing that it's hard not to discuss this immediately, from the forefront. But like you said, this movie is a brisk 3.5 hours.
Yeah. Well, one thing that you were talking about, though, originally whenever you were pitching the movie, is that you called it a slow burner. And I have a fight to pick with you on that one. I don't think it's a slow burner. I think it's actually really exciting. I think a lot happens really fast. It's just a really fucking long movie.
I agree.
There's just 3.5 hours.
I agree. But the reason why I called it a slow burner is because, to actively get to the sort of action that the movie is building towards. I mean, the movie is called Seven Samurai, right? They don't recruit, all seven samurai until, more or less the halfway point of the film. But even then, the halfway point of the film could be the length of a movie in and of itself. You see what I'm saying? So
yeah.
There's the movie. The big reason why I called it slow burner is because I felt that the movie really takes its time in the story that it wants to say. And it's not necessarily I shouldn't say without action, because I still think there's plenty of action, there's plenty of tension throughout the film, but it definitely takes its time in the story it wants to tell.
One thing that I find kind of interesting that a lot of people do nowadays is that we compliment a movie on being efficient and quick, and whenever it's a fast-paced movie, we talk about that being a highlight of it. Now with this, that's not really the case, but is it? What do you feel that this movie wouldn't really exist nowadays? Partially because people wouldn't fund it, and partially because no one would really be interested in watching a 3.5 hour movie. What do you think about that?
I feel like the only exception to people wanting to watch a 3.5 hour film is probably the superhero movies nowadays,
I forget that they're that long, though.
But really, it's only, for example, Avengers Infinity War and Endgame that are incredibly long, but they earn that because they have films and films and films behind them that they used as a sort of build up to this moment, and the amount of characters in that is absurd, as opposed to there's a lot of characters in this film right here, but nothing to the amount that those films share. So those films, in order to effectively really tell the story of so many characters who already have these sort of arcs going on, they need to take that time because, like I said, there are so many. As opposed to this one is just one story. It completely stands on its own. And even though there are very distinct characters, some get more love than others in this, one-off sort of film. It definitely, it takes its time, but I do kind of agree and see that I don't think people would be interested in the runtime, because immediately, at least for me, I've always wanted to see this film, but when I see the runtime, I get a little bit intimidated, even though there's an intermission,
It's a put off, yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's also it feels taboo to take a break in a movie. And so with this movie, I really actually did take a full length break, I really did get up at intermission and go off and do my own thing, and then come back for the next hour 45 minutes.
And And it was sort of refreshing not having to like
Yeah,
sit there through the whole thing. Yeah.
right. It was actually kind of nice because also it made it easier for me to ponder what I had seen so far and remember like character names or situations or where everyone is, because I actually have a really hard time personally, especially because I have like just the worst ADD in the world, as you will see throughout the course of the show. Um, with I have such a bad time with remembering scenes that happen, remembering character names, remembering the way things go down and what order they went down in, things like that. So this movie actually helped a lot with that, which I didn't expect of a 3.5 hour movie, but you know.
Yeah,
Um,
my personal break that I took was a coffee break. I'm sorry for interrupting. What were you gonna say?
no, I was gonna ask, did this feel kind of like a play to you?
Yes, but I want to hear the reason. Like, absolutely, and I had that thought multiple times as I was watching this
Yeah.
movie, actually. But I want to hear as to why you think or why you were reminded of a theatrical format for this film.
The very first thing, because there was a lot of different things throughout the movie, but the very first thing that I noticed, and the very first thing that felt like a play to me, is that it was it wasn't that there were a lot of scenes, because nowadays, and especially in the movies that we know, there are a lot of scenes. Like there's like 50 scenes, because and there's a different location for every one of them. But with this movie, it feels like there's a lot of scenes, but there's really not. There's a lot of French scenes. With for anyone who doesn't know, there are a lot of times whenever a character exits or enters, or they change locations and go to a different place. But that doesn't stop the scene. It's the same scene. It just moves into a different thing. And yeah, so I think that's why it felt like a play to me, is because setting-wise, they really only go to two places, and yeah, and their time skips are really elegant. They're not harsh. They don't need to narrate their time skips. It's very Shakespearean. It just ends up in a new time, and then somewhere in the scene you figure out that they're in a different time. Like it's yeah. That was the first thing for me.
You can kind of figure out that the movie takes place. I would probably estimate around a month
Yeah.
at the most.
Yeah.
You know.
But it's really clear when, weirdly enough, even though the whole movie's in Japanese, I was able to keep up with it really, really well. There was no information that I lost, I don't think. There were just a couple moments where, like, there was a certain emotional response that I was like, is there something that I missed, or is there, like, some sort of cultural divide that I don't completely understand why someone would feel that way about something, things like that happened? What do you think about that? I see you nodding your head.
Well, I do want to talk about the cultural divide that we
Yeah.
just share with this movie, and that's that's just the case of it. But really fast, I want to comment on as well, kind of the difference between you and I's thinking as to how I also saw it as a piece of theater. I kind of saw it like a piece of theater, not just because of the sort of settings, like it was very limited settings, only really between the town and the like this the merchant sort of like commercial town and the town where the farmers live. But primarily it was, for me, it was how the movie was shot, right? And so the movie had a very distinct relationship with the foreground and the background. So it felt so much like I was looking at a stage, right? And so we would get these, a lot of, mind you, we would still get close-ups, but for a lot of these shots, they're just big, wider shots, where you see multiple characters. And it's this beautiful sort of orchestration of this choreography that this movie has, where it feels like I couldn't tell if the director Akira Kurosawa was specifically telling each of these people, all right, do this, do that, do this, you're going to do this in relationship to this, all right, now you're going to move to this position, you're going to kind of like climb over this person right here. But but it felt hectic at the same time, and it was this
That's
weird.
a good word. It was. That's a good word.
But hectic in the best way possible. Like it still felt incredibly organized.
Controlled
but
chaos.
there was this sense of like intensity in the moment, right?
Right. I think another thing.
and this constant having to deal with something, as you were gonna say.
Just like you were saying, the making like pulling the shot back and showing a lot more of the actors. I have not seen in a really long time actors in films actually have a relationship with their body, and actually use movement as a medium of acting. That's really a theater thing. That's not really a thing that I see in movies ever.
Could you give an example on that?
Uh, oh, their relationship with physical comedy. Like, sure, they made funny faces and stuff, but it wasn't about the comedy didn't come from the air. The comedy didn't come from the relationship. The comedy didn't come from the eye contact or the delivery. The comedy came from the body. It was and that actually reminded me of the difference in the forms that they're coming from, because it's the 1950s, right? And in Japan,
Right.
and they're coming, like, they're fairly new in the film game, just like everyone else is, pretty much. And so they have to take they have to take inspiration from their theater, from their styles and forms of acting and directing that they already know work and exist and that they're practicing. And so for them, they're really new in the realism game. Like, realism didn't really actually hit Japan until I think 1909, whenever the free theater came in from Helsinki. That was like,
Look at you flexing this research.
look, watch out, kid, watch out. But that was their first really dip into realism. Before that, it was just kabuki. It was it was bunraku. And
But the sort of like exaggeration
yeah,
on the stage,
where
and this, I mean, still interesting storytelling, but like I'm nowhere near, for the most part, realism.
yeah, exactly. Like they had they had very little relationship to the text. It was all about how the text informed the body, and it was the body that told the story to the audience rather than the text, which is not an American thing. Like, that is so not how we see storytelling. But yeah, there was like, it reminded me of one of our professors, Stan, always talked about, like, in an ideal world, you'd be able to mute theater just like you would a basketball game and keep track of the score. And that's one of my favorite quotes, and especially like in terms of directing. And this movie, that is the epitome of this movie. You were able to mute it and keep track of the score.
I absolutely agree, and I think, obviously, I think the biggest character that kind of displays that is the character of Kikuchiyo. If
I agree.
God, I pronounced that correctly. But what? How did you feel about? I guess the acting of that character. That character was performed by, and I am ready for a massacre on both upon me and potentially upon this name that I'm going to pronounce. But Kikuchiyo was performed by Toshiro Mifune. How did you feel about Mifune's performance of this character? Did it feel out of place? Did you enjoy it? Did you, throughout this character's arc, was there something that you took away? What are your comments, I guess, overall on this character and this character's relationship to the entirety of the film?
I think that one thing that really helped me with that character is that he was constantly portrayed as the clown. He maybe initially he wasn't written that way, but the way that everyone responded to him, the way the other characters responded to him, the way the children of the village responded to him, they responded to him as if he was the clown. And so that, I think, was the big difference maker for me. So I think that might be a directing thing. But the story of the character, like the arc of the character, I mean, was fairly clear. But I felt like him, along with a lot of other people, took too much stake in consistency, specifically in their body and voice. That even though their characters might have changed and they have voiced different opinions, they still didn't look any different. They didn't sound any different. You know what I mean? They didn't seem like changed by the happenings of the story. What do you think?
I see what you're saying, and hopefully me describing the moment will kind of like light the light bulb for you. But I had that similar particular experience after when he saves the baby from the burning house that the village elder lived in. And so to briefly describe the moment, Kikuchiyo witnesses a man, his wife, and their child go across this bridge that they're taking down this bridge to the village elder's house, which is across from this bridge. And everybody knows that they're going to destroy these houses, but the village elder chooses to stay in this house. So at the very last minute, this family goes over to the house, but they don't come back. So Kikuchiyo, and eventually joined by the sort of like head samurai of the ragtag group, Kanbei, go over to the house, and they're able to find and save the baby there. And so Kikuchiyo has this sort of breakdown because it was alluded to earlier in the film that he was originally a farmer, and because of bandits and whatever town settlement he was in, had to be driven to choices that most would consider unredeemable. But he finds his baby, and he has this sort of emotional breakdown, and you see like a tremendous growth of his character in that moment. But it's hard to see after that sort of change in his character be maintained. Now mind you, like nobody changes in a day. And between that moment in the film happening and the end of the film, there's only, I think, quite literally a day. But we don't see him much different. We see him kind of slowly grow into more of a compassionate human being, but that seemed like a big change for him, but he didn't exhibit a lot of change. And I think a little bit of that is in the writing and maybe the interpretation of the character. And I'm curious on your thoughts on that, if you agree or disagree.
I completely agree with you. I think that was a really fucking good example that you did spot on. I actually would be interested to dive a little deeper into the specifically the voice and breath work of these people, because the language is very conducive to it, but also that was really clear several times in the movie from all the actors that they had a very clear relationship with their breath. But let's dive into that after a quick break and a word from our sponsor. Yeah, perfect. All right, if you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Now just let me explain. First of all, it's free. Second of all, Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and a whole bunch more. And third, now this is really important, you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Hear me when I say no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back once again to the Artenders. In this second half, I'm going to catapult with a question to good old McKean Wayne Welch.
Full name. Thank you for that. Bringing the honor to my family.
Of course. So a big thing that I took away from this movie is that, of course, with 7 samurai plus all these villagers, as I kind of alluded to in the first part, not everybody gets the sort of, runtime they need for a, growth of character. But we see bits and pieces, like with Heihachi being the sort of like funny one and Kyuzo being the serious swordsman, right? So we see these sort of, once again, these tropes of these characters. But, spoiler alert, when 4 of these samurai of the 7 die, and we're left in the film with just 3 remaining as they look up on the hilltop at their graves with the swords planted in them, and we hear the villagers celebrating in the distance. Even though we didn't seem to get like big individual runtime with each of these characters, and we didn't see a tremendous growth, like I wouldn't say the head of them all, Kanbei, really grew a lot. But I wanted to get some insight on whether or not you felt their sort of relationships with each other and the deaths of each individual one for I'm trying to remember Heihachi, Kyuzo, Kikuchiyo, and Gorobe. If you found their deaths to be like impactful in any way and like rewarding in the sort of storytelling in the film, not rewarding in the sense of like, oh good, but
Right.
like
um,
was it worthwhile, and were you impacted? Like, was it a big deal when one of these guys
I
died?
think that uh, yes, but it wasn't a big deal emotionally. It was a big deal plot wise. Whenever they individually died, I was never really hit until we looked back at everyone that had died at the very end. Um, there was never a
Mm-hmm.
time where I really felt for them, except for Kikuchiyo, which I think is exactly what they knew would happen because they saved that one for last and they made that one the most noble death. Um, that he was the person that had to change the most because he was the most selfish. It seems like they
Right.
knew that. But I never really was hit by the individual deaths, especially because the deaths happened in the middle of huge plot points. It wasn't like huge plot point
Mm-hmm.
and then someone might have died like we normally see in American movies. It was like they died, but we have to keep going. What do you think?
Yeah. Oh my god, I did not even think about that. That, well, I mean, this sort of like they have to, trudge on. Like with the first death being Heihachi, it just comes so suddenly, but they quickly like have to get out of there. And then you're also like things are happening with Rikichi, one of the villagers, and he just sees his wife, and his wife goes back into the
Yeah.
burning barn to for whatever reason, and we're not exactly sure why because we never hear a word from her. But in the middle of that, Heihachi gets shot from a musket, and so but like they have to keep going, so it's this sort of like we can't dwell on this right now. It's sort of terrifying in that weird way. But um you were saying, I agree, in terms of this sort of like emotional payoff. Like you don't really get that emotional payoff, I agree, until the very end when you see the graves, um as opposed to when they actually happen. But you said like they were big deals to the plot. Could you touch on that like a little bit more? Like when one died, what was at stake?
Yeah, I think that whenever I saw someone die, it was a lot less about, uh, I was a lot less sad about it, and I was more interested by it. Like, oh, fuck, what's that gonna mean in the long run? Um, because whenever someone died, it wasn't like this big send-off, like whenever, another spoiler alert, Iron Man dies, and then you get like the burger scene with Happy and the daughter or whatever, like that's super sad and that's a
Mm-hmm.
send off, right? But these characters never really got send offs. They died and then the plot kept moving, so it felt like it was more of a plot point than a devastating blow, because nothing was paused. I never got time to figure out that they died and feel it. I got time to figure it out, and then we moved on.
But it does leave this sort of like oh shit moment, like not just because they died, but because like okay, so what does that mean for everybody else?
Right, right. Well, because like um, instead of the characters mourning and us mourning with them, we just see the characters go, "That's not good," and then try and figure it out. And then go to the next thing, because that's just kind of how war is, I guess. But also it reminds me of um the style of acting in which they're using pretty much the entire time, which is like, uh there's the big debate between the Western and not totally Eastern, but a little more Eastern styles of acting, which is think slash feel then do, which is Stanislavski, which is what we all learn in America for the most part, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's the Meyerhold, which is do then feel. And if your body is engaged, if your breath is engaged, if everything is engaged and devoted to the storytelling, then you will eventually get to a point of thought, and feeling and emotion, or what have you. And was kind of how the story moved too, because that was how the actors were moving. The story moved with that same style. What do you think?
I mean, if I had to like choose one, it seems like, yeah, definitely this film kind of lives in this sort of, Meyerhold camp where I mean, of course, the biggest example is the sort of clown, is Kikuchiyo, that he's doing these,
Right.
big things, but it's that is what is allowing himself to internally open up. So then do you think, I don't know if whether or not you disagree or agree with the Meyerhold take, but do you think, like, at least how this movie approached with this sort of method, did you find it effective in the overall storytelling, and like, was it worthwhile?
Yeah, I think it was. I think it was really interesting to see. Because that's just not what I'm used to seeing. I'm used to seeing that on stage, but I'm not really used to seeing that in film. And I thought it was a really cool thing. Yeah, I think it's also just really conducive with their culture and language. One thing that is talked about sometimes in theater is that, especially with Shakespeare or heightened text or things that aren't entirely realism in the way that they're approaching it, is that consonants hold meaning and vowels hold emotion, which I think is like, I think that's something that can be revisited over and over and over and over and over again. Is consonants are meaning, vowels are emotion, and that's really informative to directors, writers, actors, that as you're approaching something, it's
Right.
Don't try to convey with the vowels. And that's really awesome with the Japanese language, because most of its vowels, their explosives happen super fast, and they don't have like 5, 6, 7 consonants per word like we do, or a bunch of consonant sounds like we do. So much of it is full vowels, and so their language is very conducive to them.
Yeah, it's true.
To them just speaking the language, and then the emotion will come from that.
Yeah.
What did you think of the breath work? Because all of them, oh my god, transversus fucking engaged. Like it was like their stomachs were pulsing the whole time, and they were always using full breath, like absolutely projecting in a way that's not normal to film. What did you think about that?
There were definitely moments that I I was just thinking to myself, like, wow, I can hear the breath. Of course, the particular moment that really stands out in my mind is Kikuchiyo. Of course, everything. It's like all roads lead to Kikuchiyo.
Yeah, well, because he's
Which it
just the
really
most
does.
obvious example of everything that we're talking about. Like, everyone's employing the same things that he's doing. It's just that he's doing it the most obvious.
And he's like laughing with his shoulders for so much of the film too.
Yeah.
And even though like you take this sort of like zoom out shot and you can't really see who's who, I mean, you can see it in his physicality, who he is, and it's just like how he's moving about the space with his breath and with his body is something to just purely study,
Yeah, totally agree.
But the scene that I was thinking about was just like him climbing trees in order to get the jump on some bandits, and I was just like hearing his breath, and I was like, I don't know why I was so taken aback from it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I just forget that. Oh, that's right. You're not privy to actively paying attention to breath, but a lot of times when you hear it, you notice it, and it's just like you can't help but is this sort of like empathetic sort of like physical state that you're put in, that you kind of want to like match the sort of breath and intensity that these characters are exhibiting.
And I mean, that's like the point. That's like the reason that we study breathing. Like, that's the fucking reason, I mean, to imitate a time or a place, or set your body in a place with your breath that is the same as if you were in a similar situation, or what have you. But also because whenever the audience is breathing with you, they're engaged, period. Like, that's just how it works. And
yeah.
so the more present and forward that your breath is in the scene, the more people are going to be inclined, just like you said, to breathe with you. And then they're fucking pudding. Like, that's just how it works. And another thing that caters to that is silence. but not actual silence, just breath.
You just took the words right out of my mouth. Like the words were right
Yeah.
there and you just nabbed them.
But like that was so much of the movie. So much of the movie was sitting in silence.
Well, what was your favorite example, or what was like one example that you were just like you were taken aback by? That was a particularly a moment of silence.
Whenever the youngest samurai
Katsushiro.
was caught, yes, was caught with his
Yes.
girlfriend that was posing as a boy.
Okay, so to articulate the moment,
Please.
Monzo is one of the farmers. It's like the night before the final battle, and so each member of one squad, is allowed one at a time to go and see their family for the night because it might be their last day on Earth, right? So he's trying to find his only family member, his daughter, Shino, who is probably like 18, 17, like God knows, but she's a young woman, and actually finds his daughter just after this sort of, let's just say, night with Katsushiro. When, as other samurai jokes, that he became a man, in that moment. But that sort of silence where Katsushiro comes out of that hut, sees Monzo. Monzo is just like silent and just staring. And then Shino comes out, and this sort of like relationship that's happening all entirely without dialogue is so enriching. And it's like, it's not violent in any way. And of course, it's led by a moment right afterwards that's incredibly loud. And Monzo is actively, trying to beat and calling awful names to his only daughter. But it's this moment of just tension where like it's not the most important thing that's happening in this film in terms of these characters' lives, but it's the most important thing in that particular moment, and you feel every second of that scene.
I totally agree, and it's purely because so much of it's just like you said, so much of it's silent and so much of it is just breath. It's really, really smart shit, and even more than saying words or picking a side is whenever people either go and engage with one of the people that are involved in the drama or they walk away. And that's the lines. Like that's their version of text. Which is awesome. Because I think in their minds, the text is not just the words being spoken. Because like in Shakespeare, there's very little stage direction. It's just like the words being spoken is the text. But the text to them is not... The thing to be worshipped is not the things they're saying. It is the things that their characters are choosing to do. Which, again, just like we're fucking saying this entire fucking time, wraps back to the Meyerhold thing, wraps back to the Kabuki thing, wraps back to the do, then feel thing. It's all in the same camp. Truly.
And even though, like, some of these characters, like I said 20,000 times, that they don't get as much love as you would like in this sort of storytelling, but in the moments that they are on this screen, at the very least, their relationships with one another are incredibly clear, for the most part. And it's just a treat to watch that the text is only one thing. The text is only one part. And for the most part, like all these actors and the director and Kurosawa saw that, yeah, the text is only one part. The text is only going to get us so far. But what's really going to sell this film is believing in these characters and like knowing who these characters are to one another.
Yes. Very, very, very good observation. I totally agree.
I want to ask a quick question.
Yeah.
Because there is one character on my mind that we have not discussed. That is my favorite character in this movie, which is absurd that I've yet to discuss this character.
Wow.
But I want to ask you really fast, were there any characters for you that you were not expecting to form this sort of like relationship with, or you felt like you were not expecting to feel gravitated towards this character, but then at the end of the film, you were like, man, like I can't stop thinking about this particular character. Were there any characters that, had you take away something?
Not quite. usually I'm drawn to like random people. This is the first time in a long time that I was actually really drawn to the main
Mm-hmm.
samurai leader.
To Kanbei.
Yes. Uh, yeah. Every single time that he stepped in, I all of a sudden was more comfortable. Partially because I really liked his style of acting, but also just because he was just kind of a badass. And yeah, I'm more interested who you're talking about. What?
To briefly say about Kanbei, what made him so interesting is that, like, even though he doesn't necessarily grow throughout the film, he's this
Yeah.
amazing foil to so many of these high intensity characters. And he always has this like clear head. And so when he does this sort of, the boiling over moments, um, they're super duper just rich, and it grabs your attention immediately because
Yeah.
of just how beautifully this character is set up. But
He earns the shit out of his moments.
oh, my friend, that's earns them. Oh my god, like it's.
He has about 3.5 hours to earn them, but he does it.
I know. Well, and I did this movie an injustice, but I realize now the more and more I think about this movie, like even though it's 3.5 hours and you're sitting there for a while, and I called it a slow burner, but the movie picks up.
Yes.
Like when you start really investing in this sort of not just individual characters, but the group,
Yeah.
that is when really this movie picks up for me. But the character that I personally just adore, and his relationship with Kikuchiyo, was the farmer Yohei. And if you don't
Really?
remember Yohei, he is the he is the old man who always has this sort of droopy face. His mouth is always open. And I was not expecting to love this character as much as I did. Mind you, I think a big factor was like his face just reminded me of my great grandfather.
That'll do it.
The sort of that characteristic. There was sort of a familiarity to him, but he also, like, some of the villagers had arcs of their own. Rikichi had an arc regarding, his relationship with his wife and his relationship with the rest of the village and the sort of leader he becomes. And Monzo has this sort of development where, with his relationship with his daughter Shino. But I found Yohei's to be so fascinating because the two scenes that I really think about and I really gravitate towards, one of these beginning scenes when they're still in this commercial town, and Yohei was sleeping with the rice, but for some reason, all of the rice that they had was stolen, and he's like weeping over it and is not physically able really to do anything about that. While, jump to the very end of the film, and there's this sort of relationship that grows from Kikuchiyo, like making fun of him and abusing him, but in this very sort of friendly, familial way. And it's like, it's this weird sort of tough love that at least I like.
Yeah.
I read very clearly, and I'm sure like other people would be like, man, that's tough as hell. But like it was super clear for me, that sort of relationship, that Kikuchiyo like actually loves Yohei, even though he's always making fun of Yohei. And at the very end, compared to the beginning, Yohei dies protecting his village, and says like something along the lines of, look, I stood by my post, or like I was protecting us, like something along those lines. And those were his last words. Yeah. And you don't spend a lot of time with Yohei. You really spend, more time with like Kikuchiyo and how, he interacts with Yohei. But it's one of the few characters in this film that like I have a hard time finding words for, because of how much I just loved that character. And I have some like ideas, but like I said, I'm not entirely sure why. And I mean, but that's just my takeaway. And I honestly selfishly wanted to talk about Yohei, because I mean, how could I not?
I know. I'm glad you did. That was clearly the most intense emotional response you had to the whole thing, and that's really exciting. That's super exciting, and it's also exciting that an actor was able to do something that you weren't really able to explain, but was still super effective. Because because that means that that's just more studying to do, you know?
Absolutely.
Do you want to segue into Slice of the Week?
I believe the best kind of segues, or the sort of segues that we announce, are segues. So you know what? I
agree.
Going to...
I so agree. That's the only way to do it.
So yes, I am going to segue into the Slice of the Week. And the Slice of the Week, that the song I want to share, even though we cannot physically share it, but we just want to slip it in there for you to listen to on your own time, see if you enjoy it, see what you're vibing with. And the song that I'm resonating with today is a song by, and I hope once again I'm pronouncing this name right, Labi Cifre, and it is a song called Crying, Laughing, Loving, Lying. There is an album of that name, the same title, but this is the song from that album. First of all, the whole album is fantastic, but Crying,
Laughing, Loving, Lying.
Yes, Crying, Laughing, Loving, Lying by Labi Cifre. It's a pretty short song, but it's brisk and it's beautiful and it's nice. And with that being said, I believe
it is now your responsibility to go listen to that song.
Perhaps, if you want to take it like that.
Crying, Laughing, Loving, Lying.
But in essence, really, I think the big takeaway, from this film, it's a fantastic film. I can't help but recommend it. I hope Mac feels the same way. Mac?
Yes, absolutely. Nothing but a brilliant study.
Even though it's long, it's enriching, and there are a lot of films nowadays that can't help but take inspiration from this one. So I think it's definitely worth a watch. All right, anything else, Mr. Welch?
No, just thank you. Thank you so much for listening.
All right, thank you very much. Have a good one.